The room was too quiet for a place designed to end careers worth $2.3 million. That number represented everything I stood to lose if they believed my sister. Pension, benefits, the calculated sum of 28 years compressed into a single hearing. I sat at the narrow table facing the disciplinary panel. No lawyer beside me, no folders stacked for show. Just the uniform I had earned across 3 decades and a small black bag at my feet containing a USB drive my sister didn't know existed. Colonel Marcus Brennan presided from the center position, flanked by 4 officers whose expressions gave nothing away. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have, each second a metronome counting down to something irreversible. Across the room, not beside me, not anywhere near me, my sister Diane Sullivan Clark stood adjusting a stack of documents with the careful precision of someone who wanted to appear prepared without seeming nervous. Navy blazer, pressed slacks, the expression she had perfected over 2 decades in compliance work, concerned, responsible, disappointed that someone else had forced her into this position. She cleared her throat, the sound sharp in the stillness. "Colonel Brennan," she began, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "I'm here to formally report Sergeant Catherine Sullivan for falsifying her military service record and misrepresenting her qualifications for financial gain." The words landed like coins dropped into still water. No splash, just ripples spreading outward. A few heads turned slightly toward me, expecting reaction. Denial, protest, some visible sign of disturbance. I gave them nothing. My hands remained flat on the table, fingers still, breathing unchanged. Diane continued without looking at me. She addressed the panel, the colonel, anyone but her sister. The discrepancies involved deployment timelines, role designations, and commendation records. Taken together, they suggest intentional misrepresentation. She paused, letting the accusation settle before delivering the knife. More critically, Sergeant Sullivan is currently being considered for a GS-13 oversight position with significant salary increase, a position that will determine her highest 3 years for pension calculation, potentially adding $15,000 to $20,000 annually in retirement benefits. Her fingers traced the edge of her topmost document. If these records have been inflated, my sister has already benefited financially by over $200,000 during her career. She stands to benefit by an additional $400,000 in retirement. This is not a paperwork discrepancy, Colonel. This is potential fraud with clear financial motive. The panel shifted. Someone inhaled slowly. The junior officer leaned forward half an inch, pen hovering over his notepad. This was no longer about mixed-up dates or clerical errors. Diane had framed this as a scheme, a calculated deception spanning years, built on greed. Colonel Brennan's gaze moved to me, patient and measured. "Sergeant Sullivan, do you wish to respond to the allegation at this time?" This was the moment everyone in the room anticipated. The moment I would defend myself, explain, argue against numbers and accusations that sounded damning when stripped of context. I felt the weight of their expectation pressing down like atmospheric pressure before a storm. "No, sir." 2 words, flat, final. Brennan studied me for 3 full seconds, his expression unreadable. "You're declining to make a statement." "Yes, sir." He didn't push. He nodded once and turned his attention to the thick file in front of him. The official record. Everything the system had documented about me over 28 years. Orders, evaluations, deployment logs, performance reviews, commendations, reprimands, every signature that mattered. The file was 3 times as thick as the one Diane had brought. He opened it slowly, the sound of turning pages too loud in the silence. First page, second page. I sat perfectly still, shoulders squared, back straight the way I had learned to sit in rooms where I controlled nothing. Across from me, Diane's posture relaxed fractionally, just enough to notice if you knew her. She trusted this part, the part where authority took over, where her carefully prepared documents would speak louder than my silence. Brennan reached somewhere near the middle of the file and stopped, not paused, stopped. His eyes tracked back to the top of the page, then down again, slower this time. He leaned forward the way someone does when double-checking a detail that doesn't fit the expected pattern. The silence stretched. The junior panel member glanced at Brennan, then at the file, then at me. The clerk's pen touched paper, lifted again when no words followed. Brennan turned 1 page backward, then forward. I watched his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He didn't look at Diane, didn't look at me. He stared at the document like it had personally offended him. After several seconds that felt much longer, he closed the file halfway, resting one hand on the cover. Excuse me. It wasn't an announcement. It wasn't a command, just a statement, delivered in the same tone someone might use to mention they were stepping out for coffee. He stood, chairs scraped. Someone behind me inhaled sharply. Brennan picked up the file, tucked it under his arm, and walked toward the side door that led to his chambers. No explanation. No instruction to wait, he simply left the room. The door closed behind him with a soft final click. For a moment, no one moved. Then the room filled with the small sounds of confusion. A chair creaking, a quiet cough, whispered words I couldn't quite hear. The junior panel member leaned toward the clerk, murmuring something urgent. Diane turned her head slightly, watching the closed door, her brow furrowing in a way I recognized. She hadn't expected this. None of them had. I stayed exactly where I was, hands on the table, eyes forward. My pulse hadn't changed. My breathing remained steady. This wasn't shock. This was confirmation. Because when Colonel Marcus Brennan reached that page in my file, he hadn't seen Catherine Sullivan, Sergeant Service Number redacted, current assignment pending. He had seen a mistake that shouldn't exist, a discrepancy between what my sister claimed and what the records actually showed. And men like Brennan don't walk out of a hearing unless something is very, very wrong. The chair across from me scraped lightly as Diane shifted her weight. It was a small sound, but in a room gone still after the judge's exit, it landed like a drumbeat. I didn't look at her. I focused on the edge of the table where the laminate had chipped, a tiny flaw I had noticed when I first sat down. I traced it once with my thumb, slow and deliberate, then stopped. No one told us to speak. No one told us to wait. The system doesn't always provide instructions when it's recalibrating. The junior panel member leaned back in his chair, trying to project relaxation and failing. The clerk stared at her monitor like it might suddenly explain what had just happened. Two officers in the back row exchanged glances that communicated the same silent message. That wasn't standard procedure. Diane cleared her throat again, keeping her voice low, careful not to sound impatient. Is this normal? The clerk didn't answer. She didn't know. But I did. Silence, in a military disciplinary hearing, isn't empty space. It's active. It means something is being weighed elsewhere by someone who doesn't need commentary to reach a conclusion. I sat with my back straight and my shoulders squared, the posture drilled into me across thousands of formations, briefings, inspections. The posture that communicates more than words ever could. Panic slouches. Confidence doesn't fidget. Guilt shifts and stammers. Innocence waits. Diane glanced at me just once. I kept my eyes forward. She had expected something by now. A protest, an outburst, a whispered explanation she could twist into doubt. Instead, she got nothing. And that bothered her more than yelling ever would have. This wasn't the first time my silence had made people uncomfortable. Years earlier, during a logistics review overseas, a colonel had accused my team of misreporting fuel usage. The numbers didn't align with his expectations. And he wanted someone to argue. He wanted excuses, explanations, reasons why the data looked wrong. I let him talk. I waited until he ran out of air, until his face flushed and his voice went hoarse. Then I handed him the original manifests, signed and dated, every entry accounted for. He stared at them for a long time before muttering an apology he didn't mean, and never repeating the accusation. I learned then that silence forces the other side to keep going. And people who keep going long enough eventually show their hand. They reveal what they're really after, what they're afraid of, where their certainty ends and their desperation begins. Diane shifted again, this time crossing her legs with a sharp, controlled movement. She tapped the edge of her folder with one finger, a habit from her compliance days, something she did when waiting for meetings to start or audits to conclude. She looked composed on the surface, but there was a crack forming underneath. I could see it in the way her jaw tightened every few seconds, in the way her eyes kept flicking toward the closed chamber door. She leaned toward the clerk. "Do you know how long this usually takes?" The clerk shook her head. The colonel didn't say. Diane nodded, lips pressed thin. A tight line of forced patience. Of course. She sat back, then turned and looked at me directly for the first time since the hearing began. You really don't have anything to say? Her tone was controlled, but there was an edge now. Not concern, not disappointment, something closer to disbelief. I turned my head slowly and met her eyes. No, one word, that was all she got. Her expression flickered. Not anger, not yet, but frustration looking for a place to land. You're comfortable letting this play out? I held her gaze. Yes, that was all. She scoffed softly, shook her head like I was making her job harder than it needed to be, like this was still about efficiency and process rather than what it actually was. A demolition attempt dressed in bureaucratic language. The room settled into waiting. Minutes passed. 10, maybe more. Time stretches differently when no one is controlling the clock. When the next move belongs to someone behind a closed door, reviewing documents you can't see. I could feel the weight of my records sitting in that chamber. Every evaluation I had earned, every signature that mattered, every report I had stayed late to double check because someone else had missed a detail that could have turned into a catastrophe. Diane had built her case on anomalies, on edges, on moments where reality didn't fit neatly into a spreadsheet. What she didn't understand was that the military doesn't run on clean narratives. It runs on documentation layered across time, signed by people who remember what it cost when something went wrong. It runs on chains of custody and verification protocols and redundant record-keeping specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of selective interpretation she was attempting. The door to the chambers opened abruptly. Conversation I hadn't realized was happening stopped mid-breath. Colonel Brennan stepped back into the room, the file no longer under his arm. He wasn't carrying anything now. His face was unreadable, but the tightness in his jaw was gone, replaced by something heavier. Not anger, but the kind of focused determination that comes from finding something that demands immediate attention. He didn't sit down right away. "Ms. Clark," he said, looking directly at Diane, "I have a few questions regarding the materials you submitted." Diane straightened instantly, her professional mask sliding back into place. "Of course, sir." Brennan nodded once. "You stated that Sergeant Sullivan's deployment timeline conflicts with her stateside assignment. Can you clarify the source of that information?" Diane didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir. The dates are pulled from personnel records and archived unit rosters available through the contractor access portal." Brennan's eyes didn't leave her. "Which roster specifically?" She paused just for a fraction of a second. "The ones available through the standard contractor access portal used for compliance verification." Brennan let the silence sit for a moment. "You're aware those are secondary records." Diane's chin lifted slightly. "They're commonly used for compliance verification, sir. They're verified data." "Commonly," Brennan repeated, his tone neutral. "Not exclusively." He turned to the clerk. "Pull the primary deployment orders from the archive. Authorization code 77 Alpha. I need the original documents, not the aggregated summaries." The clerk's fingers moved quickly over the keyboard. Brennan looked back at Diane. "You also flagged an issue with a commendation title. The one from 2015. Yes, sir. It lists Sergeant Sullivan as acting lead when her assignment code at the time didn't correspond to a leadership position." Brennan tilted his head slightly. "Assignment codes change when billets change. Titles don't always follow the same timeline. Were you aware of the distinction?" Diane opened her mouth, then closed it. Her hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the folder in front of her. "I was aware that the codes should align, sir." "Should," Brennan said, "under normal circumstances. But operational necessity creates exceptions. Were you aware of the protocols for temporary scope expansion during personnel shortages?" Diane hesitated. "Generally, yes." Brennan finally glanced at me. "Sergeant Sullivan remained seated?" "Yes, sir." He turned back to the panel. "We're going to continue this review with original source documents. I want primary records cross-referenced against every claim in the complaint. No summaries, no aggregated data. Original signatures, original timestamps, original authorization chains." Diane's confidence didn't collapse. It thinned, like ice beginning to crack from underneath, still holding but no longer solid. "That's fine," she said, her voice steady. "I'm confident the records will support my report." Brennan didn't respond to that. The clerk looked up. "Primary orders are loading, sir." Brennan stepped closer to the monitor and leaned over the screen, reading something I couldn't see from my angle. I watched Diane watch him. Her hands were folded now, fingers interlaced, knuckles pale. She had believed silence was weakness, that my refusal to defend myself meant I had no defense to offer. She hadn't considered that silence might be a choice. And in rooms like this, choice is everything. The clerk's keyboard clicks faded into background noise as something else claimed my attention. Not what was happening in the present, but what had brought me here. Families don't fall apart in dramatic explosions. They erode slowly, quietly, usually with everyone convinced they're doing the right thing. Diane had always been good at that particular kind of conviction. Growing up, she was the one who knew how to talk to adults. She learned early which words made people nod and which ones shut conversations down before they started. When teachers praised her, our parents glowed. When I brought home a solid report card, they nodded once and asked what Diane had accomplished that week. It wasn't cruelty. It was efficiency. Diane fit the version of success our parents understood. Articulate, ambitious, socially fluent in ways I wasn't. She went to the right schools, asked the right questions, built the right connections. When she joined the military briefly after college, they called it valuable experience. When she left after 18 months and moved into civilian compliance work, they called it strategic positioning. When I enlisted at 24, a widow with $50,000 in life insurance money and nothing tying me to any particular future, they called it impulsive. My husband David had died in a car accident 18 months into our marriage. No children, no substantial assets. Just a modest insurance payout and a choice about what came next. My mother told me to move back home, that I was young enough to start over, to find someone else. Diane suggested I use the money for a down payment on a small house, maybe rent out a room to cover costs. I did neither. I walked into a recruitment office and signed papers that would define the next 3 decades. I needed structure that didn't shift based on who you knew or how well you performed in social situations. I needed rules that applied the same way to everyone, where value is measured in demonstrable competence rather than personality. The military promised that, show up, do the work, own the results. No explanations required, no performance of enthusiasm, just results. Diane never understood that choice. She saw a system, something to be navigated and optimized. She talked about advancement strategies and networking opportunities and positioning for post-service careers. I talked less. When I did speak, it was about timelines and accountability, and what happens when people don't double-check their work before signing off. Our parents listened to both of us, but they believed her. She sounded like authority. I sounded like resistance. That difference mattered now, sitting in this hearing room while she accused me of fraud, and I said nothing in my own defense. My first assignment wasn't glamorous. Logistics support for a unit that ran on tight margins and tighter tempers. The work was simple in theory. Keep people supplied, keep timelines honest, keep mistakes from turning into incidents. In practice, it meant long nights reconciling numbers that didn't want to align, and early mornings explaining why accuracy mattered more than convenience. I learned quickly that accuracy beats speed. Speed impresses people in the moment. Accuracy keeps them out of trouble later. There was a deployment early in my career where that lesson crystallized into something I never forgot. We were short on personnel after 2 rotations ended back to back. The schedule didn't adjust. The mission didn't pause. Someone had to coordinate movements, track fuel consumption, sign off on changes that were happening faster than normal approval chains could handle. I wasn't assigned as lead. I was assigned to assist, so I assisted until there was no one left to assist. When the acting lead got pulled to deal with an unrelated incident, the work didn't stop. The radio kept crackling, requests kept coming in. I stepped into the gap because there was a gap, and I was standing in it. No announcement, no ceremony, just a chair that needed filling and a checklist that needed completing. That's how most responsibility works in military logistics. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. It shows up when someone else leaves the room and the work still has to get done. The reports from that period weren't elegant. There were adjustments made under pressure, decisions signed off with limited information, the kind of documentation that looks messy later if you don't know the conditions it was created under. But it was documented. Every change, every authorization, every deviation initialed by someone higher up the chain who understood why it mattered. That was the part Diane never saw when she built her case against me. She saw titles and timestamps. I saw signatures and authorization chains. She saw timelines that didn't align perfectly. I saw who had approved the exceptions and why. The commendation she flagged had come months later, a recommendation from a commanding officer who didn't hand those out lightly. It didn't praise heroics or exceptional achievement. It cited continuity, accountability, and decision-making under constraint. Not flashy, just solid. The kind of recognition that matters more than medals because it reflects sustained competence, rather than a single moment of excellence. Brennan cleared his throat, pulling me back to the present. These logs show Sergeant Sullivan coordinating task flow during a personnel shortage, he said, scrolling through something on the clerk's monitor. Her role expanded temporarily to cover critical functions. The scope increase was documented through emergency protocol authorizations. Diane leaned forward slightly. Temporarily doesn't mean officially, sir. Officially enough to be documented, Brennan replied. The distinction you're drawing doesn't exist in operational practice. Assignment codes reflect billets. Billets don't always reflect function during crisis response. The junior panel member nodded slowly, eyes on the screen. This explains the title discrepancy. Diane shook her head, but the movement was smaller now, less certain. The assignment code still reflects her billet, not the leadership function. Codes reflect structure, Brennan said. Function reflects necessity. Military doctrine accounts for this. Were you aware of that when you filed your complaint? Diane pressed her lips together and didn't answer. The clerk looked up. Sir, archived unit logs confirm her presence and activity during the deployment window in question. Multiple entries across 72 hours show continuous coordination and authorization signatures. Brennan nodded, which are more precise than contractor portal summaries. I could feel the shift in the room. It wasn't dramatic. No one raised their voice. No one stood up or made sweeping declarations. But the weight was moving, inch by inch, degree by degree. That's how systems change direction. Not with a shove, but with a recalibration so gradual, it's almost imperceptible until the new alignment becomes obvious. Brennan turned another page in the digital file. Your report also questions the speed of Sergeant Sullivan's advancement, calling it faster than average. Diane nodded. Yes, sir. It stood out as unusual. Standing out isn't a violation, Brennan said. It requires explanation, which is what evaluations and promotion boards provide. She paused, then pressed forward. It can also indicate favoritism, sir. Brennan looked at her directly. Are you alleging favoritism? Diane hesitated, caught between commitment and retreat. I'm saying it should be examined, sir. Favoritism leaves traces, Brennan said. Missing evaluations, skipped boards, unexplained waivers, or exceptions to standard procedures. He tapped something on the screen. I'm not seeing those patterns here. The silence that followed was different from earlier silences. This one had texture, weight. I thought about the promotion board process, the waiting. The envelope slid across a desk with no commentary attached. You don't celebrate until you're certain it's real. And even then, you keep the celebration quiet, because celebrating advancement feels like tempting fate. I had been certain because I knew the work behind it. Diane had been skeptical because she saw only the outcome, not the foundation. She folded her hands now, knuckles whitening slightly. Colonel, with respect, my concern is pattern-based. Small inconsistencies that accumulate into something larger. And my concern, Brenton said, is whether those inconsistencies exist in primary records or only in aggregated summaries that strip away context. The clerk spoke without looking up. Sir, primary evaluations are consistent across all reporting periods. No gaps, no anomalies in the approval chain. Brennan nodded. Thank you. Diane glanced down at her papers again. She flipped a page, then another. Her movements were still precise, but the rhythm was off. She was searching now, not presenting, looking for something she had believed would be there, some piece of evidence that would vindicate her decision to bring this accusation forward. Brennan turned to me. Sergeant Sullivan, were you ever instructed to alter or omit information from your service record? No, sir. Did you ever submit documentation you knew to be false or misleading? No, sir. He held my gaze for a moment, then turned back to Diane. Miss Clark, do you have evidence that directly contradicts those statements? Diane opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I have reason to believe that certain records were interpreted generously. Brennan didn't react. Belief isn't evidence. Do you have documentation showing intentional falsification? She pressed her lips together. Then why did you leave the room earlier, sir? The question came out sharper than she had probably intended, revealing frustration she had been working to contain. Brennan's eyes narrowed slightly. Because something in the record didn't align with your framing of it. I needed to verify what I was seeing. Diane frowned. What specifically? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured to the clerk. Pull the archived authorization memo from that deployment period. July through October 2015. Emergency protocol designations. The clerk's fingers moved across the keyboard. I felt something shift inside me. Not relief, not satisfaction, but the steady certainty that comes when truth has enough room to stand on its own without requiring defense. Diane leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. The confidence she had walked in with hadn't vanished, but it was no longer in charge of the room. She had built her case on the assumption that my service record looked too clean to be real, that advancement and commendations arriving at convenient times must indicate something fraudulent. What she hadn't accounted for was how much work it takes to keep a record clean. How many double checks, how many late nights verifying numbers, how many times choosing accuracy over speed, even when speed would have been easier, and no one would have noticed the difference. The clerk's screen refreshed, and an authorization memo appeared with a soft chime that seemed too loud in the quiet room. Brennan leaned in to read it, his expression unchanged, but his focus absolute. I watched Diane's eyes track his movement, trying to read meaning from posture alone. That used to work for her in corporate settings, in conference rooms where watching who nodded and who frowned told you which way decisions were leaning. It didn't work here. Brennan's face gave nothing away. Promotions in the military don't happen by accident. They leave footprints, boards convene, evaluations stack. Someone asks hard questions, and someone else signs their name under the answers, taking responsibility for the assessment. When my promotion came through years ago, it didn't feel like a breakthrough moment. It felt like the system acknowledging work it had already been using, recognizing value it had already extracted. The assignment that positioned me for advancement wasn't prestigious. It was oversight, review, verification. The kind of role commanders fill with people who won't improvise with facts or cut corners when accuracy becomes inconvenient. The position sat adjacent to larger compliance functions involving contract performance, documentation integrity, process adherence. It touched multiple systems without owning any of them completely. It also made people nervous, not because of what I did, but because of what I might find if I looked closely enough. Brennan scrolled through the memo slowly. This authorizes temporary scope expansion for emergency operations, issued due to operational necessity during personnel shortage, signed by the acting unit commander and countersigned by 2 field officers. Diane shook her head. That memo doesn't explain the promotion that followed, sir. It explains the performance that led to promotion, Brennan replied. Advancement doesn't precede achievement. It follows. She exhaled sharply. Colonel, with respect, this feels circular. It's linear, he said. Work comes first. Recognition follows. That's not circular. That's sequential. Diane glanced at the panel, searching for support. The junior member was reading intently now, no longer looking around the room. The clerk had stopped typing and was simply waiting. Diane turned back to me, her expression harder than it had been. You were selected for a role that reviews processes tied to contractor compliance, a role that began shortly before this complaint was filed. Her eyes sharpened as she delivered what she clearly believed was a damning connection. Do you see how that looks? I see how it works, I said. Brennan raised a hand slightly, signaling he would handle this. Miss Clark, are you suggesting a conflict of interest? I'm suggesting proximity, she said carefully. Access to oversight functions in areas where documentation irregularities could be concealed if someone had the right position. The word concealed hung in the air between us. Brennan folded his hands on the table. That's a serious implication. So is falsifying a service record, Diane shot back. Brennan didn't react to the deflection. You're asserting motive now, not just documentation discrepancies. She met his gaze. I'm asserting opportunity, sir, and timing. I watched her do it in real time, shift the frame from documents to intent, from what I had allegedly done to why I might have done it. That was her strength in compliance work. When facts didn't cooperate, she interrogated motivations. It was also her tell. The move she made when the case she had built wasn't holding up under scrutiny. Brennan turned to the clerk. When was Sergeant Sullivan notified of her selection for the GS-13 position? 3 weeks before her reporting date, sir. And when was this complaint filed? The clerk checked her records. 9 days after the notification. Diane's jaw tightened visibly. Brennan nodded once. That timing matters. It shouldn't, Diane said quickly. Whistleblowing isn't convenient by nature. No, Brennan agreed, but it is contextual. And context includes examining why concerns arise when they do, particularly when they coincide with someone obtaining authority that might affect the complainant's professional interests. The room stayed quiet, not awkward, but focused, attentive. I thought back to the briefing where I had first learned about the new role. The language had been careful, measured. You're being considered. Your background fits the requirements. There may be sensitivities involved. I hadn't asked which sensitivities. I had simply accepted the information and prepared for the vetting process. Diane had asked. She called that night, not angry but curious in a way that felt calculated even then. She wanted details. The scope of the position, who else was involved, what systems I would have access to. I had answered in general terms, enough to be polite, not enough to give her a map of my future responsibilities. At the time, I had thought she was just being thorough, engaged with my career in a way she rarely had been before. Now, watching her build a case around access and proximity, I understood the recalibration she had made in real time. She hadn't been proud of me. She had been assessing threat levels. Brennan spoke again. Miss Clark, this isn't about timing alone. It's about timing combined with methodology. Your complaint relies heavily on secondary aggregation from contractor portals, data designed for broad oversight, not forensic review. You've taken that aggregated data and constructed a narrative of fraud without verifying against primary sources. Why? Diane's hands were flat on the table now, fingers spread. I use the tools available to me, sir. The same tools used for compliance verification across the defense industry. For audits, Brennan said, not for disciplinary action. There's a significant difference. The clerk spoke again. Sir, I'm pulling archived board notes from the promotion review in question. Brennan nodded without looking away from Diane. Please do. Diane sat back, the movement defensive now rather than composed. I want to be very clear, sir. I came forward because I believe the record was misleading. Belief is not the standard here, Brennan said. What is? She asked. Verifiability, chain of custody, primary source confirmation. Standards designed specifically to prevent accusations based on interpretation rather than evidence. She swallowed, a small movement but visible. And if primary sources confirm the anomalies I identified, then we proceed with appropriate action, Brennan said. If they don't, we ask why you framed them the way you did. She glanced toward the door behind him, the one leading back to his chambers. This feels like scope creep, sir. It's due diligence, he replied. The standard we apply to every allegation of this severity. The clerk looked up. Board notes are loaded, sir. Brennan turned the monitor slightly toward himself. Lines of text appeared, dense with abbreviations and decision points. He read silently for several seconds. These notes reference the oversight role. They also reference prior performance evaluations and documented achievements during operational stress periods. Questions were raised and answered during the board process. Diane leaned forward, reading what she could see from her angle. Those are summaries, sir. They're contemporaneous records, Brennan corrected, signed and archived according to protocol. She pointed at something on the screen. That section about risk tolerance, that's subjective interpretation. Everything evaluated by humans contains subjective elements, Brennan said. That's why we have boards instead of algorithms. The question isn't whether judgment was involved. The question is whether that judgment was documented and defensible. She straightened. You're treating this like an internal disagreement between interpretations. I'm treating it like an allegation with consequences, he said, which requires precision in both the accusation and the evidence supporting it. Her voice sharpened slightly. So my background in compliance counts for nothing in assessing whether records appear irregular? It counts, Brennan said. It doesn't override military procedure or substitute for verification against primary documentation. The distinction landed harder than anything else he had said. Diane had spent years operating adjacent to authority, advising it, auditing it, interpreting regulations and standards for clients who trusted her expertise. In her world, proximity to power was leverage. Here, it wasn't. Brennan turned to me again. Sergeant Sullivan, did you ever communicate with your sister about the scope of your oversight role prior to this complaint being filed? Yes, sir. Did you provide her with documents or access to non-public information? No, sir. Did you advise her on compliance matters related to defense contractors? No, sir. He nodded. Thank you. Diane looked at me, disbelief creeping into her expression for the first time. "You didn't think to warn me about potential conflicts?" "Warn you about what?" I asked. She hesitated, then stopped herself. Brennan caught the pause. "About what, Miss Clark?" She didn't answer. The room settled into a new alignment. Not adversarial in the traditional sense, but evaluative, investigative. The focus had shifted so gradually that the transition felt almost natural, until you looked back and realized how far the center of gravity had moved. Brennan closed the document file on screen and leaned back in his chair. At this point, the issue before us isn't whether Sergeant Sullivan's advancement appears unusual at first glance. The issue is the integrity of the materials used to challenge it, and the timing of that challenge relative to her pending assignment. Diane's confidence didn't shatter. It narrowed, compressed into something denser and more fragile. She had expected the promotion to look suspicious under scrutiny. Instead, the scrutiny had become a spotlight that didn't stay where she had aimed it. And in a system that documents everything, spotlights have a way of revealing more than intended. The clerk rotated the monitor back toward herself and began pulling another set of files, this time from a different archive level. The sound of the system processing was steady, methodical, not rushed, not dramatic. That was the part most people misunderstood about investigations like this. They don't accelerate toward climax. They widen, they deepen, they accumulate context until the truth becomes unavoidable, not because someone proved it decisively in a single moment, but because every alternative explanation fell away under the weight of documentation. "Before we proceed further," Brennan said, addressing the room generally, "we need to address the status of the complaint itself." Diane lifted her chin. "On what grounds, sir?" "On evidentiary sufficiency and procedural concerns. When an allegation relies primarily on derivative data and omits verification against primary documentation, it raises questions about methodology and intent." "That sounds like semantics," she said. "It's governance," Brennan replied, "and governance determines jurisdiction. Sergeant Sullivan, you may step out briefly while we confer on process." I stood, gathered nothing because I had brought nothing except myself and the USB drive still in my bag, and walked toward the side door. As I passed Diane's table, she didn't look at me. Her eyes stayed fixed on Brennan, on the panel, on anyone who might still validate the choice she had made to bring me here. The hallway outside was empty and cool, institutional lighting casting everything in the same neutral tones. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. Not from exhaustion, but from the simple need to exist for a moment without being observed. The USB drive pressed against my leg through the fabric of the bag. I hadn't used it yet, hadn't needed to. The primary records were doing exactly what I had known they would do, telling the truth in a language more credible than any accusation built on aggregated summaries and suspicious timing. But the drive contained something else, something I had been holding in reserve, not as a weapon, but as context, as the final piece that would make clear not just that I was innocent, but why Diane had been so desperate to make me look guilty. Inside that drive was everything I had collected over the past 4 months about Sterling Defense Compliance Group, the company where Diane worked as compliance director, the company currently under audit by the Defense Contract Audit Agency for potential credential misrepresentation, the company that would fall directly under my oversight purview in the new position. I had done the research properly, through authorized channels, as part of my preparation for the role. I had disclosed Diane's employment there on the required conflict of interest forms. I had followed every protocol designed to ensure transparency and accountability. Diane had done none of those things. She had accessed contractor portal data to investigate her own sister, built a case using tools meant for broad compliance review, rather than forensic accusation, and filed it 9 days after learning I would soon have authority to examine her employer's practices. The door opened. The clerk stood there, expression neutral. "Sergeant Sullivan, you can return now." I pushed off the wall and walked back into the hearing room. Diane was still in her seat, but her posture had changed. Less certain, more defensive. The panel members had shifted positions slightly, no longer oriented toward me, but toward the front of the room where Brennan sat with a new document in front of him. I took my seat. Brennan waited until the door closed before speaking. "We've reviewed the procedural concerns. Given the reliance on secondary data, the timing relative to Sergeant Sullivan's pending assignment, and the absence of primary verification. This panel is changing the case status from disciplinary action to administrative review. Diane leaned forward sharply. What does that mean? It means we're no longer evaluating Sergeant Sullivan's record for misconduct. We're evaluating the complaint itself, its construction, its sourcing, and its motivations. You can't just dismiss a report because it's inconvenient, she said. I can set it aside when it's insufficiently supported by primary evidence, Brennan replied. He turned to the clerk. Update the case status accordingly. The clerk's fingers moved. A status indicator on her screen changed color. Diane's eyes tracked the change, her face pale now. So that's it? She walks away clean and I'm under investigation? She walks away with her record intact, Brennan said. You're being reviewed for process concerns, which is standard when allegations fail to meet evidentiary thresholds and raise questions about methodology. This is retaliatory, Diane said. It's reciprocal, Brennan corrected. The system doesn't punish people for raising concerns. It does examine how those concerns were raised and whether appropriate protocols were followed. The junior panel member spoke for the first time in several minutes. Ms. Clark, did you attempt to resolve these discrepancies through internal channels before filing a formal complaint? Diane glanced at him. I didn't feel that would be effective. Why not? He asked. She hesitated. Because of potential conflicts of interest. Which conflicts? Brennan asked. She looked down at her papers. Because my sister was involved. Because it was family. That's precisely why internal channels exist, Brennan said. To provide mediation and objective review when personal relationships complicate professional concerns. Diane's voice tightened. You're assuming bias on my part. I am evaluating risk, he replied. Risk to fairness, risk to process integrity, risk to both parties involved. The clerk cleared her throat. Sir, I'm noting edits in the contractor summary timestamps. Version updates within the review window. Brennan leaned forward. Explain. The summaries show revision histories. Updates made during the same period Miss Clark was compiling her complaint materials. Stephanie's head snapped up. That's normal. Summaries update dynamically as data refreshes. Do they overwrite prior versions? Brennan asked. They can, depending on system settings. Brennan nodded slowly. So the data you reviewed 6 weeks ago may not reflect the same information available today. It reflects current verified data, she said. Which isn't the same as historical accuracy, he said. Another reason primary records matter. The room shifted again, subtle but unmistakable. Every assumption Diane had built her case on was being examined not for malice, but for reliability. And one by one, those assumptions were proving less solid than she had believed. Let me be clear, she said, frustration breaking through her professional composure. I did not alter anything. No one has accused you of alteration, Brennan said. Then what are you implying? That interpretation matters, he said. That presentation matters. That using tools designed for one purpose to serve another purpose can produce results that look definitive but lack necessary context. The clerk spoke again, quieter now. Sir, original logs confirm Sergeant Sullivan's presence and documented role during all flagged periods. Brennan nodded. Thank you. Diane leaned back, arms crossed tightly across her chest. So you're dismissing everything I brought forward? Not yet, Brennan said. We're examining how it was constructed. There's a difference. She laughed once, short and humorless. I brought legitimate concerns forward in good faith. Good faith requires restraint, Brennan said. Escalation only when internal processes have been exhausted and evidence is sufficient to justify formal action. Neither of those conditions appears to have been met here. She stared at him. So what now? Now we review the sworn statements you submitted from family members, the affidavits signed by your parents. Her expression flickered, just for a second, but I saw it. The moment she realized that every step she had taken to strengthen her case had simply added more points of scrutiny. The more official she had made it, the more accountable she became. Brennan turned slightly in his chair. At this stage, we're no longer asking whether Sergeant Sullivan's record appears inconsistent at a glance. We're asking about the integrity of the complaint itself. The words settled into the room, steady and unavoidable. Diane had come here to build a case against me. What she hadn't planned for was being asked how she built it, why she built it when she did, and what she stood to gain or lose depending on the outcome. And in a system that records every step, those questions don't need anyone's permission to keep going. Brennan gathered several documents from the clerk and spread them across the table in front of him. The affidavits Diane had submitted sat on top, crisp white paper, with notarized signatures at the bottom. Our parents' names in careful script, witnessed and dated 2 weeks before the hearing. Miss Clark, your complaint includes sworn statements from Richard and Patricia Sullivan. Are they present today? No, sir, but they're available if the panel requires their testimony. What materials did they review before signing these statements? Diane straightened slightly, regaining some composure. The same contractor's summaries I presented to you, sir. They examined the documentation and agreed that the discrepancies warranted formal review. Did they examine primary records? The question landed quietly, but I watched something shift in Diane's expression. They're not military personnel, sir. They wouldn't have access to— That wasn't my question, Brennan interrupted. Did you provide them with primary military records, or only the aggregated summaries from contractor databases? Diane's fingers tightened on her folder edge. I provided them with the information I had access to. Which were summaries, Brennan said, not source documents. They trusted my professional judgment, Diane replied, her voice carrying a defensive edge now. I'm sure they did. Brennan leaned back slightly. But that makes them dependent witnesses, not independent verifiers. They reviewed materials you selected and interpreted those materials through your framing. They're her parents, the junior panel member added quietly, not neutral third parties. Diane's jaw set. They're also my parents, and they wanted to ensure integrity in military service records. Brennan nodded once, his expression unchanged. Noted, we'll return to that. First, I want to address the financial analysis you presented. He pulled out the spreadsheet Diane had created, the one calculating my alleged fraudulent gains down to the last dollar. It looked even more damning on paper than it had sounded when she first presented it. Columns of numbers, highlighted totals, a grand sum at the bottom that made 28 years of service look like an embezzlement scheme. You calculated that Sergeant Sullivan benefited by over $200,000 through alleged record inflation and stands to benefit by an additional $400,000 in retirement. Walk me through how you arrived at these figures. Diane's confidence flickered back. Numbers were her territory, her language. She had built her career on quantitative analysis and audit findings. Yes, sir. I have a detailed breakdown. She pulled out her own copy of the spreadsheet, fingers moving across the columns as she spoke. From 2010 through 2015, deployment pay premiums based on allegedly inflated duration totals, $45,000. From 2015 through 2020, pay differentials for acting positions not matching assignment codes, $38,000. 2020 through present rank-based housing allowances potentially enhanced by improper advancement, $52,000. Bonus payments tied to commendations, $18,000. That's the past benefit, $153,000. She flipped to the next page. Future benefit calculations include the GS-13 salary over a projected 5-year period before retirement, approximately $475,000 total compensation. Enhanced pension based on highest 3 calculation, $1.44 million lifetime value. Total future benefit, $1.915 million. The room had gone completely still. Even the clerk had stopped typing. Grand total financial motive, Diane finished, $2.068 million. Brennan studied the spreadsheet for a long moment. That's remarkably detailed work, Miss Clark. Thank you, sir. I wasn't complimenting the effort. I was noting the specificity. He turned to the clerk. Pull Sergeant Sullivan's actual pay records, not summaries. I want disbursement logs, direct deposit records, every payment she's received over the past 15 years. The clerk's fingers moved quickly. Diane watched the screen, her expression guarded now. While we're waiting, Brennan continued, let me ask you something. In your professional compliance work, when you find a discrepancy, what's standard practice? Diane blinked at the change of direction. Verify against source documents, sir. Cross-reference multiple data points. And if those sources contradict each other, then you investigate the contradiction to determine which source is accurate. Brennan nodded slowly. So in your professional work, you wouldn't typically build a fraud case on a single data source without verification. Correct, sir. Yet that's what you did here. The observation hung in the air. Diane opened her mouth, closed it, seemed to recalibrate. I used the tools available to me, sir. You used the tools you had access to, Brennan corrected. That's not the same as using the right tools for the purpose. The clerk looked up. Sir, I have the pay records loaded. Put them on screen. The monitor filled with lines of data, deposits, amounts, dates, tax withholdings. Brennan scrolled slowly, his eyes tracking across columns I couldn't see from my position. Interesting, he said after a moment. Very interesting. What is it, sir? The junior panel member asked. A discrepancy. Brennan pointed at something on the screen. Deployment records show Sergeant Sullivan qualified for hazard pay grade 3 during an 8-month period in 2015. But disbursement logs show she was only paid at grade 2. Diane leaned forward sharply. That would mean she was underpaid, Brennan finished, by approximately $4,800 for that deployment alone. He scrolled further. There are additional instances. A housing allowance that should have adjusted when she changed duty stations, but didn't update for 3 months. A reimbursement for extended duty that was approved but never processed. The clerk, can you calculate the total? The clerk worked for several seconds. Across the periods I can verify, sir, total underpayment is approximately $11,400. Brennan turned to face me directly. Sergeant Sullivan, were you aware of these payment discrepancies? No, sir. Did you ever file to correct them or claim the missing amounts? No, sir. I trusted the finance system to be accurate. When deposits came through, I assumed they were correct. So the person accused of committing fraud for financial gain actually failed to claim money she was legitimately owed. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Diane's carefully constructed financial analysis had just collided with evidence that I had been underpaid, not overpaid, that I had left money on the table rather than seeking every possible dollar I could claim. Brennan looked at Diane. Ms. Clark, in your detailed financial investigation, did you verify whether Sergeant Sullivan had ever failed to claim full entitlements? That wasn't the focus of my analysis. It seems relevant to me, Brennan said. It establishes a pattern, one that contradicts your accusation of financial motivation. Diane's face had gone pale. Payment processing errors don't negate the broader pattern of record irregularities, sir. No, Brennan agreed. But they do raise questions about your analytical completeness. You calculated alleged gains to the dollar while missing legitimate shortfalls in the thousands. That's selective investigation, not thorough audit. He gestured to the clerk. Note that we'll be initiating a payment correction review for Sergeant Sullivan. She's entitled to back pay plus statutory interest, approximately $13,700 total. Diane looked like she had been struck. The woman who had calculated my supposed fraud down to the penny was now watching me receive money she hadn't known I was owed. Money I had never asked for, never noticed missing, never tried to claim. Sir, I need to be clear, Diane said, her voice strained. My concerns were based on pattern recognition across multiple data points. Based on incomplete data, Brennan interrupted. Using methods appropriate for broad compliance oversight, but insufficient for forensic accusation. He stood, not to leave this time, but to walk closer to where Diane sat. Let me explain something about the difference between compliance review and disciplinary action, Ms. Clark. Compliance review identifies areas needing attention. It flags possibilities. Disciplinary action requires proof. It demands verification. You crossed from the first to the second without doing the work to justify that escalation. Diane sat rigid in her chair. I followed my professional judgment. Your judgment was clouded by something, Brennan said. The question is what? He turned to the clerk again. Pull the incident log from July 2015, the supply chain disruption that required emergency rerouting. Diane straightened. Sir, I don't see how an incident log is relevant to a personnel record review. You wouldn't? Brennan said quietly. That's part of the problem. The clerk pulled up a document dense with timestamps and action items. The title read, Operational Disruption Summary, Emergency Protocol Response. I recognized it immediately. This was the 72-hour period that had defined my early career. The crisis that had led to the commendation Diane was now questioning. Brennan scrolled through entries, his expression shifting from neutral to something harder to read. I remember this incident, he said. The junior panel member looked up. You do, sir? Yes, because it nearly became a formal inquiry. I had to sign an after-action report explaining why it didn't require investigation. He gestured at the screen. There was cascade risk, one delay triggering another, potential for mission failure and security exposure. Someone stabilized it. He scrolled to a specific section. This attributes coordination to Sergeant Sullivan. She wasn't the designated lead, but she maintained operational continuity through emergency authorization protocols when the assigned officer was pulled to handle a separate crisis. Diane's fingers gripped the table edge. That's exactly the irregularity I flagged, sir. She acted outside her authority. With authorization, Brennan cut in. Emergency protocol specifically allows temporary scope expansion when operational necessity demands it. The question isn't whether she exceeded her normal assignment. The question is whether she did so properly, with appropriate authorization and documentation. He pulled up another document. Here's the authorization memo. Signed by Captain Reynolds, countersigned by Captain Rodriguez, approved retroactively by a field commander after review of the decision chain. Everything documented, everything accounted for. But her assignment code never changed, Diane pressed. Because assignment codes reflect billet structure, not operational reality during crisis response, Brennan said. This is basic military procedure, Miss Clark. The fact that you don't understand the distinction raises questions about your competence to evaluate these records at all. The words landed like a judgment. Diane wasn't just wrong, she was demonstrably out of her depth, making accusations about systems she didn't fully understand. I felt something shift inside me, but it wasn't triumph. It was sadness. Sadness that my sister had done this to herself, had built a case so thoroughly that it was now collapsing under its own weight, exposing not my fraud, but her desperation. Brennan returned to his seat. Let's talk about timing, Miss Clark. You filed this complaint 9 days after your sister was notified about her GS-13 selection. Why then? Diane's answer came too quickly. That's when I completed my analysis. You told this panel earlier that you'd been reviewing the data for 6 weeks. So you completed 6 weeks of analysis, exactly 9 days after learning about her new position. Is that accurate? Diane hesitated. The final compilation took time. Or, Brennan suggested, you accelerated your timeline when you learned she would soon have oversight authority that might affect your employer. Silence filled the space that followed. Diane didn't respond because there was no good response. Any answer would either admit suspicious timing or require her to explain why 6 weeks of work suddenly concluded within days of learning about my promotion. Let me ask directly, Brennan said. Does Sterling Defense Compliance Group currently have any pending audits or investigations by defense oversight agencies? Diane's face went carefully blank. I can't discuss my employer's proprietary matters in this forum, sir. I'm not asking for proprietary information. I'm asking about publicly available audit status. Yes or no? Her jaw worked for a moment before she answered. There are routine audits ongoing. That's standard in our industry. The Defense Contract Audit Agency has Sterling under enhanced scrutiny for credential misrepresentation, doesn't it? How would you know that? Diane's voice rose slightly. Because it's public record, Brennan said calmly, and because your sister properly disclosed her relationship to your company when she accepted her new position. She followed protocol. Did you? Diane went very still. I don't understand the question. Did you disclose to anyone at Sterling that you were investigating your sister? Did you inform them that she was being considered for a position that would give her direct oversight of contractor compliance practices? I didn't see a need because it might have required you to recuse yourself from accessing contractor portal data for personal purposes, Brennan finished, because it might have raised questions about whether you were using company resources to conduct a private investigation. The clerk spoke quietly. Sir, contractor portal access logs show Miss Clark ran queries on Sergeant Sullivan's records 17 times over 6 weeks, all outside normal business hours. 17 times, Brennan repeated. All after hours. All focused on one individual who happens to be your sister and who is about to gain authority to review your employer's practices. Diane's hands were shaking now just slightly. I had concerns about integrity. About your own integrity or hers? Brennan asked. The question landed like a physical blow. Diane opened her mouth, but no words came. She looked at me for the first time since Brennan had started pulling apart her case, her eyes searching for something. Understanding, maybe, or forgiveness I wasn't ready to offer. I want to present additional evidence, I said. Every head in the room turned toward me. It was the first time I had volunteered anything beyond direct answers to questions. Brennan nodded. Proceed, Sergeant. I reached down and pulled the USB drive from my bag, held it up so everyone could see. This contains documentation I compiled over the past 4 months as part of my preparation for the GS-13 position. Research on major defense contractors in the oversight portfolio, including Sterling Defense. It also contains records of my communications with my sister during that period. I handed the drive to the clerk. She plugged it into her system, and files began appearing on the screen: articles, audit notices, email chain logs. File 1, I said. Defense news article from 6 months ago, reporting that Sterling Defense is under investigation for credential inflation and billing irregularities. The article filled the screen. Brennan read aloud. Sterling Defense Compliance Group faces enhanced scrutiny from DCAA for potential misrepresentation of contractor personnel qualifications. Preliminary findings suggest systematic inflation of military experience levels in billing documentation. He looked at Diane. You're the compliance director. This investigation falls under your responsibility. Diane's voice came out thin. I'm aware of the investigation, sir. I'm cooperating fully with auditors. File 2, I continued. My disclosure form submitted 4 months ago, declaring family relationship to an employee of Sterling Defense and requesting guidance on potential conflicts of interest. The form appeared, my signature, the date, the agency stamp confirming receipt and review. I disclosed Diane's employment the moment I knew Sterling was in my oversight portfolio, I said. I followed protocol. I asked for guidance on how to handle the relationship appropriately. And what guidance did you receive? Brennan asked. That I should document any contact with my sister regarding professional matters and maintain clear boundaries between family communication and oversight responsibilities. Did you follow that guidance? Yes, sir. File 3 appeared on screen. A detailed log of every phone call, email, and text message between Diane and me over the past 6 months. Timestamps, durations, brief summaries of content. February 10th, I said. Diane called at 11:45 p.m. She asked me to decline the GS-13 position, said it would create appearance problems. I declined to withdraw my candidacy. February 17th, 1 a.m., second call. She said my record had irregularities that would come to light if people scrutinized it closely. She suggested I protect myself by stepping back before those irregularities were discovered. The room was utterly silent now. February 24th, I concluded. Diane filed her formal complaint. Brennan studied the timeline displayed on screen. The calls, the escalation, the complaint filing. The pattern was undeniable. Diane had tried to convince me to remove myself from the position. When that failed, she had tried to remove me forcibly by destroying my credibility. Miss Clark, Brennan said slowly, did you file this complaint to prevent your sister from obtaining a position that would give her oversight authority over your employer? Diane's face had gone from pale to flushed. I had legitimate concerns about her records. That's not what I asked. Did you file this complaint to prevent her from gaining oversight authority? Yes or no? The silence stretched for 5 full seconds before Diane spoke. The timing was unfortunate, but my concerns were real. Concerns founded on secondary data you never verified, filed after multiple attempts to convince her to withdraw, submitted 9 days after you learned she would have access to review your company's compliance practices. Brennan closed the file folder in front of him with deliberate care. This hearing is adjourned pending review of these materials by the Judge Advocate General's office. We need to determine whether this complaint represents a good faith allegation or an attempt to interfere with legitimate oversight functions. Diane half stood from her chair. Sir, you can't seriously be suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything, Brennan interrupted. I'm stating that we have concerns about the complaint's integrity that require formal review. Until that review is complete, no further action will be taken regarding Sergeant Sullivan's record. He looked at me. Sergeant Sullivan, you're free to leave. Your record remains clear pending final closure of this matter. Your GS-13 selection is unaffected. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. As for you, Miss Clark, Brennan continued, turning back to Diane, you should expect contact from the appropriate oversight bodies regarding your use of contractor portal access for personal investigations and potential conflicts of interest in filing this complaint. Diane's legs seemed to give out and she sank back into her chair. My clearance. If I lose my clearance, I can't work in defense contracting. That will be determined by the Security Office review, Brennan said. I can't prejudge their findings. But you can flag concerns, Diane said bitterly. I can and I have. Accuracy cuts both ways, Miss Clark. You demanded exacting standards for your sister's record. Those same standards now apply to your conduct in challenging that record. The panel members stood, gathering materials. The hearing that had been designed to end my career was ending Diane's credibility instead. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt hollow, watching my sister realize in real time what she had done to herself. The room began to empty. Officers filed out. The clerk powered down her system. Brennan departed through his chamber door without ceremony. Within 2 minutes, only Diane and I remained. She didn't look at me immediately. She stared at her spreadsheet, at all those carefully calculated numbers that had meant to prove my fraud and had instead revealed her desperation. "You planned this," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," I replied. "I plan to protect myself. There's a difference. You let me build the case, let me present it, knowing you had all this." I gestured at the USB drive the clerk had left on the table. "I didn't know what you'd do." "I hoped you wouldn't do anything. But when you called me at 1 in the morning demanding I withdraw from the position, I knew I needed documentation. So I documented everything. Not to trap you, to protect myself." Diane's hands were shaking as she gathered her papers. "You're going to report Sterling, aren't you? You're going to destroy my career." "I'm going to do my job," I said. "If Sterling has violations, I'll report them. Not because you're my sister, not because you tried to destroy me, because that's what the position requires. The difference between us," I continued, "is that you used your position to attack me. I'll use mine to enforce standards that apply to everyone, including your company. That's not revenge. That's integrity." Diane looked up at me then, really looked at me, and what I saw in her eyes was something close to recognition. Not understanding, not regret, but the dawning awareness that we operated by fundamentally different rules, and hers had just failed catastrophically. I picked up my bag and walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard her start to cry, quiet, restrained sounds that spoke more to frustration than remorse. I didn't turn back. The hallway outside was cooler, institutional lighting washing everything in neutral tones. I walked past empty offices and closed conference rooms until I found the women's restroom. Inside, I locked myself in a stall and stood there, forehead against the cold metal door, breathing slowly until my hands stopped trembling. I hadn't lied to Diane. I had planned to protect myself. But protection had required me to document my sister's escalating attempts to undermine me, to save evidence of her midnight phone calls and veiled threats, to research her employer's problems so I would understand what was motivating her desperation. I had done all that while hoping I would never need to use it, while hoping she would step back from whatever edge she was approaching. But hope isn't a plan, and I had learned long ago that the best defense is thorough preparation combined with the discipline to reveal nothing until the moment demands it. Someone knocked on the bathroom door. "Sergeant Sullivan, it's Colonel Brennan." I unlocked the stall and walked out to the sinks. Brennan stood just inside the bathroom entrance, professional distance maintained. "Are you all right?" "Yes, sir. Just needed a moment." He nodded. "What you did in there, maintaining silence until you had complete information about how she built her case, that took exceptional discipline." "Thank you, sir. But I need to ask you something directly, and I need a truthful answer." "Of course, sir. Did you know Sterling Defense had problems before you accepted the GS-13 position?" I met his eyes. I knew they were on the pending audit list, yes. It's public information. I disclosed my relationship to Diane immediately because I knew it might create appearance issues. I asked for guidance on how to handle it properly. Everything I did was documented and by the book. "And your research on Sterling over the past 4 months?" "Was part of my preparation for the oversight role, sir. I needed to understand the contractors I would be reviewing. I used authorized channels, disclosed my findings appropriately, and maintained professional boundaries throughout." Brennan studied me for a moment. "Your sister is going to face consequences. You understand that?" "Yes, sir. Some of those consequences will affect your family relationships." "I understand, sir, but she made her choices. I made mine. We both have to live with the results." He nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, you handled this correctly. You could have confronted her earlier, could have tried to intervene privately. But you let the system work. That shows trust in process and respect for procedure." "It shows I knew I was right, sir. When you know you're right, you let the documentation speak. You don't argue, you wait." "That's wisdom not everyone learns," he said. "You'll make a good oversight coordinator." "I hope so, sir. I'd say, sir." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. That back pay, $13,700. You really didn't know you were owed it?" "No, sir. I trusted finance to be accurate." "Most people would have checked," he said. "Would have verified every payment, especially with a career as long as yours." I shrugged. "I was focused on doing the work, sir, not maximizing every dollar I could extract from the system." He smiled slightly. That's exactly why you'll be good at oversight. You understand the difference between following rules and gaming them. After he left, I washed my hands slowly, watching water run over my fingers. In the mirror, I looked the same as I had this morning. Same uniform, same face, same carefully controlled expression. But something had shifted beneath the surface. I had come into that hearing room prepared to defend myself if necessary. I had left with my record intact, and my sister facing the consequences of her own accusations. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt tired. Tired of family dynamics built on comparison and competition. Tired of being underestimated by people who confuse silence with weakness and frugality with poverty. Tired of having to document everything, prepare for betrayal, trust process more than people. But tiredness wasn't the same as regret. I had made the right choices. I had followed procedure. I had protected myself without attacking anyone, had let truth emerge through documentation rather than argument. That was worth the exhaustion. My phone buzzed, a text from my mother. Diane called. She's very upset. What happened at the hearing? I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed a reply. The hearing went well for me. Ask Diane what happened. I need to hear her version first. The response came back almost immediately. She says you sabotaged her, that you had evidence you didn't share until it was too late for her to respond. I typed carefully. I shared evidence when appropriate. The panel needed to evaluate her case on its merits first. They did. Her case didn't hold up. That's not sabotage, that's process. Another message. Your father and I signed those papers. Did we make a mistake? That was the question I had been waiting for. The moment my parents would have to confront what they had done, trusted one daughter's version without verifying, signed legal documents based on incomplete information, participated in an attempt to destroy my career, because Diane had framed it as protecting integrity. I wrote back, you signed papers based on information Diane gave you. She didn't give you all the information. Draw your own conclusions about what that means. I put the phone away without waiting for a response. My parents would have to work through their own reckoning with what they had been part of. I couldn't manage that for them. Outside, the late afternoon sun slanted through windows, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I walked to my car, the paid-off Toyota that Diane had mocked as evidence of my modest circumstances. I sat in the driver's seat and pulled out my phone again, this time opening my banking app. Checking account, $8,200, enough for months of expenses if necessary. Savings account, $43,000, emergency fund fully funded. TSP retirement account, $680,312. Decades of consistent contributions, growing steadily. Rental property value, approximately $165,000, generating $1,400 a month in passive income. Pension value, $1.2 million over expected lifetime. Total net worth roughly $1.89 million. I had built this quietly, without announcement or celebration, through consistent choices compounded over time. While Diane bought designer watches and leased luxury cars, I contributed maximum amounts to retirement accounts. While she took expensive vacations, I increased my savings rate. While she focused on appearing successful, I focused on being secure. She had calculated my supposed fraud at $2.06 million, a number slightly higher than my actual legitimate net worth built through discipline and restraint. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so sad. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. Traffic was light on the way home. I drove past strip malls and office complexes, past the gym where I worked out 3 mornings a week, past the grocery store where I bought generic brands and used coupons without shame. My apartment was modest. 1 bedroom, clean and organized. The furniture was functional, purchased for durability rather than style. The decorations were minimal. It looked like the home of someone living within limited means, careful with every dollar. It was actually the home of someone who had achieved financial independence at 54 and could walk away from everything tomorrow if necessary. That was the freedom money bought when you accumulated it properly. Not the freedom to spend without thinking, but the freedom to make choices based on what mattered rather than what you could afford. The freedom to say no. The freedom to let a hearing play out without panic, because you knew you could survive the worst outcome financially. The freedom to enforce standards even when it meant facing your own sister across an investigation table. Diane didn't understand that kind of freedom. She understood salary and title and visible markers of success. She understood leverage and positioning and strategic advancement. But she didn't understand security that came from needing less while having more. I made a simple dinner: chicken breast, rice, vegetables. Cost maybe $4. Nutrition, more than adequate. Satisfaction, exactly what I needed, nothing more. While I ate, I checked the news. An article caught my attention. Sterling Defense Compliance Group faces expanded investigation. I skimmed the content. The Defense Contract Audit Agency was broadening its review based on new findings. Contracts worth millions were being suspended pending resolution. Diane was compliance director of a company in serious trouble. Even if she kept her security clearance, even if the review of her complaint came back without formal sanctions, her professional world was crumbling. The company might not survive the audit. Her job might not survive the company's problems. And I would be part of the oversight team, reviewing exactly those problems. Not because I wanted revenge, but because that was the job I had been selected to do. My phone rang, my mother. I answered. "Hi, Mom." "Kate, we need to talk about this. Your father and we didn't understand what was happening." "I know," I said simply. "Diane told us your records had problems. She showed us documents. We thought we were helping." "You signed affidavits without asking me about them first." Silence on the other end. Then quietly, "We should have asked you." "Yes, you should have." "Are you angry?" "I'm disappointed," I said. "There's a difference. Your father wants to know if there will be problems because we signed those papers. The panel knows you were given selective information. You're not in trouble. But you participated in something without doing your own verification. That has consequences for our relationship." More silence, then, "What kind of consequences?" "I haven't decided yet. But things can't go back to how they were, not immediately." "We're your parents, Kate." "And I'm your daughter, but you believed Diane without question and didn't give me the same trust. That matters." She didn't speak for several seconds. When she did, her voice was thick. "We made a mistake." "Yes," I said. "You did, and now we all have to figure out what comes next." After I hung up, I sat on my couch and stared at nothing in particular. Family relationships weren't like financial accounts. You couldn't just balance them with careful management and consistent deposits. They required trust, and trust once broken didn't rebuild on a schedule. My sister had tried to destroy my career to protect her own interests. My parents had helped her without asking my side of the story. The hearing had cleared my name and exposed Diane's motivations. But it hadn't repaired what those actions had broken. I didn't know if repair was even possible, or if I wanted to invest the emotional energy required to find out. What I did know was that I had protected myself successfully. I had documented everything, disclosed appropriately, followed procedure precisely. I had trusted the system more than I trusted my family, and the system had proven more reliable. That was a sad truth, but it was truth nonetheless. And in the end, I thought as I prepared for bed, truth matters more than comfort. Security matters more than appearance. Integrity matters more than relationship when relationship requires compromising integrity to maintain it. I had learned that lesson slowly over 28 years of military service. Today, I had applied it to the hardest test I had ever faced. Tomorrow, I would continue building the life I had chosen. Disciplined, secure, accountable only to standards I could defend with documentation. And if that life looked lonely from the outside, well, loneliness was just another cost of clarity, one I had learned to afford. 3 weeks passed before the official closure documents arrived. A single envelope, military return address, containing 2 pages that summarized the hearing outcome in language designed to convey maximum information with minimum emotion. Case closed. Record cleared. No adverse action. Back pay approved and processed. GS-13 appointment proceeding as scheduled. I read both pages twice, then filed them in the folder I kept for important documents. Birth certificate, marriage license from a lifetime ago. David's death certificate, military contracts, property deed. The hearing summary went between my last performance evaluation and my retirement projection worksheet. Documentation of a life built in layers, each page representing a choice that had accumulated into something substantial. The back pay deposited 3 days later, $13,712.18 after taxes. I transferred the entire amount to my TSP account before the money could feel real enough to spend. The contribution pushed my retirement balance over $693,000. I was 54 years old with more wealth than most people accumulated in entire careers. And nobody in my family knew because I had never told them, and they had never asked. That ignorance had protected me during the hearing. Diane's financial analysis had been built on assumption that I was chasing money I didn't have, inflating records to secure benefits I couldn't otherwise achieve. She had calculated my supposed greed without realizing I had already achieved more security through discipline than she had through a salary twice my size. The irony would have been satisfying if it weren't so exhausting. Work continued. I reported to the transition office and began the onboarding process for the oversight coordinator position. Training modules, security briefings, system access protocols, the bureaucracy of advancement, tedious but necessary. During one particularly long briefing about audit procedures, the instructor mentioned Sterling Defense as an example of ongoing contractor reviews. "They're facing significant findings," she said, clicking through a presentation slide. "Credential misrepresentation, billing irregularities, inadequate internal controls. The company will likely need to replace senior compliance leadership and implement remediation plans." I took notes without commenting. Around me, other incoming coordinators shifted in their seats, absorbing information about companies they would soon oversee. None of them knew I had a sister who was the compliance director at Sterling. None of them knew she had tried to destroy my career to prevent exactly this kind of oversight. That distance felt appropriate, professional separation between personal history and official duty. After the briefing ended, the instructor approached me. "Sergeant Sullivan, I wanted to mention your name came up in a coordination meeting last week. Apparently there was some question about conflict of interest regarding Sterling Defense." I nodded. "My sister works there." I disclosed the relationship when I accepted the position. The instructor smiled. I saw the disclosure. "Very thorough documentation. The review board cleared you completely. Just wanted to let you know there's no concern on our end about your assignment to the Sterling oversight team." "Thank you for clarifying." She lowered her voice slightly. "Between us, your sister's situation is complicated right now. The company is cooperating with DCAA, but there are questions about whether leadership knew about the credential issues or should have caught them earlier." I kept my expression neutral. "That's outside my area. I'll be reviewing documentation, not personnel decisions." "Of course. Just thought you should know the landscape." After she walked away, I sat alone in the empty briefing room and stared at my notes. Diane's professional world was collapsing in slow motion. Her company under investigation, her judgment questioned, her credibility damaged by the failed complaint against me. Even if she kept her job through the immediate crisis, her trajectory had changed. She would spend years rebuilding trust she had spent decades accumulating, and I was part of the system examining the failures she was responsible for preventing. I hadn't chosen that alignment. I had simply accepted a position I was qualified for, disclosed potential conflicts appropriately, and allowed the process to determine where I belonged. But the result was the same. I would be reviewing my sister's professional failures as part of my official duties. That wasn't revenge, but it wasn't comfortable either. My phone buzzed, a text from my mother. "Your father and I would like to take you to dinner. We need to talk about what happened." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "When?" "Saturday night, 6 o'clock. The Italian place you like." "I'll be there." 3 days' notice. Enough time to prepare emotionally for a conversation I didn't particularly want to have, but couldn't avoid forever. Family relationships didn't end with a hearing verdict. They required active dissolution or active repair, and neither happened accidentally. Saturday arrived cold and clear. I dressed carefully, nice slacks, a sweater, civilian clothes that didn't carry the weight of rank or service. I wanted to meet my parents as their daughter, not as Sergeant Sullivan, whose record had been vindicated while their other daughter faced professional consequences. The restaurant was half full when I arrived. My parents sat in a corner booth, both looking older than I remembered from just a month ago. My father's hair seemed grayer. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her water glass. They stood when I approached. My mother hugged me carefully, as if uncertain whether I would accept the gesture. My father shook my hand, then pulled me into a brief embrace that felt both familiar and foreign. We sat. The waitress came and went with drink orders. Nobody spoke until after she left. "Kate," my mother began, her voice unsteady, "we owe you an apology." "Yes," I agreed, "you do." My father flinched slightly at the directness. "We should have asked you before signing those papers. Diane showed us documents, explained the discrepancies, and we trusted her interpretation." "You trusted her without verifying," I said. "That's different from trusting because you verified." My mother's eyes filled. "She's our daughter. We didn't think she would lie." "She didn't lie exactly," I said. "She presented selective information and let you draw the conclusions she wanted you to reach. That's manipulation, not lying. But the effect is the same. We signed legal documents accusing you of fraud," my father said quietly. "We helped her try to destroy your career." "Yes," I said simply, "you did." The words sat heavy on the table between us. I could have softened them, could have offered reassurance that I understood their position, could have made this easier. I didn't. They needed to sit with the full weight of what they had participated in. My mother dabbed at her eyes with her napkin. "We never meant to hurt you." "Intent doesn't erase impact," I replied. "You meant to help Diane. The impact was that you endorsed accusations against me without asking my side of the story." My father leaned forward. "What can we do to fix this?" "I don't know if you can," I said. "Trust isn't like a broken dish you can glue back together. It's more like a foundation with cracks. You can repair the cracks, but the foundation never carries weight the same way again." My mother's hands twisted the napkin. "Are you saying you don't want a relationship with us anymore?" "I'm saying the relationship we had before is over," I replied. "What comes next, if anything comes next, will be different. It has to be." "Different how?" my father asked. I thought about how to explain something I was still figuring out myself. Before the hearing, our relationship operated on assumptions. You assumed Diane was more successful because she earned more money. You assumed I needed help or guidance because I chose military service instead of corporate advancement. You assumed when faced with a conflict between your daughters, Diane's version deserved more credibility. Those assumptions are gone now. You saw what happened when you acted on them. So if we rebuild anything, it has to be based on actually knowing me instead of assuming you know me based on what's visible from the outside. "What does that mean practically?" my mother asked. "It means you don't get to compare us anymore," I said. "You don't get to talk about Diane's salary or her job title or her house in a way that implies I'm falling short. You don't get to assume I need financial advice because I drive an old car. You don't get to participate in family dynamics where one daughter is the success story and the other is the modest one who stayed in her lane." My father looked stricken. "We never meant to make you feel that way. How you made me feel is less important than what you actually did," I replied. "You created a dynamic where Diane felt entitled to my career prospects being less legitimate than hers, where she felt comfortable using your signatures on legal documents to attack me. That didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because you've spent 30 years treating her accomplishments as more valuable than mine." The waitress returned with food none of us had much appetite for. We picked at meals mechanically while silence filled the spaces between bites. Finally, my mother spoke again. "Diane lost her job." The statement landed without preamble. I set down my fork. "When?" "Yesterday. Sterling Defense is restructuring. All senior compliance staff are being replaced as part of the remediation plan." I absorbed that information without visible reaction. "Is she okay financially?" My mother shook her head. "She has some savings, but not much. The mortgage is large. She was living close to her income level, so she'll need to downsize," I said. "She's devastated, Kate. This was her career, her identity. She made choices that led to this," I replied. "I didn't report her to her employer. I didn't leak information about the hearing. I did my job properly and let the system work. Her consequences came from her own actions, not from anything I did." My father's voice was quiet. "Can you help her?" The question hung in the air like smoke, visible but intangible. "Help her how?" I asked. "Financially, just until she gets back on her feet. A loan maybe, or—" "No," I interrupted. "Kate, please, she's your sister." "She's the sister who tried to end my career," I said, "who calculated my supposed fraud down to the dollar while planning to benefit from destroying my credibility. Who used you both as weapons in her campaign against me?" I leaned back, suddenly exhausted. "I have helped people I care about when they needed it. I've loaned money to friends, covered expenses for colleagues facing emergencies, donated to causes I believe in. But Diane doesn't need financial help because of bad luck or circumstances beyond her control. She needs it because she made destructive choices and is now facing their consequences. That's not something I'm going to rescue her from. But she's family, my mother said, her voice breaking. Family didn't stop her from trying to destroy me, I replied. Why should it stop me from letting her experience the results of that attempt? The harshness of my own words surprised me, but I didn't take them back. They were true, even if they were painful to speak and painful to hear. My father pushed his plate away. What do you want from us, Kate? What would it take for you to forgive us? Time, I said. Honesty, consistency. No more comparisons between Diane and me. No more assumptions about my life based on surface appearances. No more signing things or supporting accusations without hearing both sides. And regarding Diane specifically, I need you to stop asking me to help her in ways that excuse her from accountability. If she needs emotional support, give her that. If she needs help finding resources or navigating job searches, help with that. But don't ask me to save her from consequences she earned. My mother's tears fell openly now. This feels cruel, Kate. It feels like boundaries, I corrected. Boundaries you taught me were selfish when I was younger. Boundaries Diane learned she could cross because you never enforced consequences when she did. I pulled out my wallet and placed cash on the table to cover my meal. I need to leave. This is too much for one conversation. Will you talk to us again? My father asked. Eventually, I said, but I need space first. I need to figure out what relationship I want with you, separate from the relationship you want with me. Those aren't the same thing, and for 30 years I've prioritized your version over mine. I stood. My mother reached for my hand. We love you, Kate. I know, I said. But love without respect or trust isn't enough to build on. We'll talk when I'm ready. I walked out into the cold evening air, leaving them sitting with their half-eaten meals and their incomplete understanding of what they had broken. The drive home took longer than usual. I pulled into a park halfway back and sat in the parking lot watching joggers circle the path, watching parents push children on swings, watching people inhabit lives that looked uncomplicated from the outside. My phone buzzed. Diane. I stared at her name on the screen for several seconds before answering. Hello? Kate. Her voice sounded hollow, defeated. I heard you had dinner with Mom and Dad. They told you that quickly? I called them right after. I wanted to know what happened. What do you want, Diane? A long pause, then, I want to apologize. Okay, I said, apologize. Another pause, longer this time. I'm sorry I filed the complaint. I'm sorry I involved Mom and Dad. I'm sorry I used professional tools for personal purposes. I'm sorry I calculated your career in dollars like you were committing fraud when you were just living your life. The apology came out rehearsed, like she had practiced it multiple times before making the call. Are you sorry you did it or sorry it didn't work? The silence that followed answered the question better than words could have. Both, she finally admitted. I'm sorry I hurt you, but I'm also sorry it backfired and destroyed my career instead of yours. I can't separate those things. I wish I could tell you I'm purely sorry for the harm I caused, but I'm also sorry for the harm it caused me. At least that's honest, I said. I lost my job, Kate. Sterling fired me yesterday, effective immediately. They gave me 2 weeks severance and a non-disclosure agreement. That's it. 14 years with the company gone in a 30-minute meeting. I know, I said. Mom told me. And you're not going to help. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. No, I'm not. Her laugh was bitter. Of course not. Why would you? I tried to ruin you, and instead ruined myself. Perfect karma, right? It's not about karma, I said. It's about accountability. You made choices based on protecting your interests at my expense. Those choices had consequences. I'm not going to shield you from experiencing them. I have a mortgage I can't pay, Kate. Car payments, credit card debt. My savings will last maybe 3 months if I'm careful. Then you'll need to make hard choices, I replied. Sell the house. Trade the Mercedes for something you can own outright. Pay off the credit cards. Find a cheaper apartment. Get a job that doesn't require security clearance. Live within your actual means instead of your desired image. You make it sound easy. It's not easy, I said. It's necessary. I made those choices 30 years ago when David died, and I had $50,000 and no plan. I chose security over appearance. You chose the opposite. Now you're going to learn what I learned. That building from nothing is hard but possible if you're willing to sacrifice pride for progress. I don't know how to do what you did. she said quietly. Then learn, I replied. You're 52, not 70. You have time to rebuild if you're willing to actually rebuild instead of waiting for someone to rescue you. Is that what you think I'm doing? Waiting for rescue? I think you called me expecting sympathy and maybe financial help, I said. I think you wanted me to be the bigger person and extend assistance despite what you did. But I'm not going to do that, Diane. Not because I can't afford it. I could write you a check right now that would solve your immediate problems. But because solving your immediate problems would prevent you from learning what you need to learn, which is that financial security comes from discipline, not income. That wealth is built through choices, not salary. That you can earn 6 figures and still be broke if you spend 6 figures. That comparing yourself to others is a trap that makes you either arrogant or desperate, depending on who you're comparing yourself to. You sound like you're lecturing me. I am lecturing you, I said, because for 30 years you assumed I was the one who needed education. You assumed your MBA and your compliance certifications and your corporate salary meant you understood things I didn't. But you don't understand the basics, that less can be more, that restraint builds options, that security is more valuable than status. So you're just going to watch me struggle. I'm going to let you struggle, I corrected. There's a difference. Watching implies I'm invested in the outcome. Letting means I'm releasing responsibility for fixing what you broke. That's cold, Kate. That's clarity, I replied. I spent decades being what people needed me to be. Quiet so Diane could be loud. Modest so you could be ambitious. Careful so you could be bold. I built my life around not threatening yours. And the first time I accepted a position that happened to intersect with your professional world, you tried to destroy me rather than simply existing alongside my success. I get it, she said, anger creeping into her voice. I was wrong. I messed up. You're the righteous one and I'm the failure. You've made your point. No, I said. You're not a failure. You're facing consequences. Those aren't the same thing. Failure is permanent. Consequences are educational if you let them be. She was quiet for a moment. Did you know this would happen? When you accepted the oversight position, did you know it would lead to this? I knew Sterling was being audited, I said. I knew you worked there. I disclosed the relationship and asked for guidance on handling potential conflicts. I followed every protocol designed to ensure I could do my job without bias. What happened after that, the hearing, your job loss, all of it, came from your choices, not mine. But you could have declined the position. I could have, I agreed, but why should I? Why should I limit my career to protect yours from scrutiny? The oversight position was offered because I'm qualified. I earned it. Declining would have been letting your situation control my choices. I wasn't willing to do that. So my job loss is just collateral damage to your career advancement. Your job loss is the result of Sterling having compliance problems you should have caught, I corrected, problems that existed before I accepted any position. I'm not responsible for your company's failures or your failure to prevent them. Diane exhaled slowly. I don't think we can fix this, Kate. Too much damage. Probably not, I agreed. At least not in any time frame that matters to you right now. So we just, what? Never speak again? I don't know, I said. Maybe we need years apart. Maybe we need different boundaries. Maybe we need to accept that being sisters doesn't mean being close. But I know I'm not interested in pretending everything is fine or rushing forgiveness because that's what family is supposed to do. Mom and Dad are devastated. They participated in something that devastated me, I replied. Their feelings about the consequences don't erase what they did. You really are cold, Diane said. I'm finally putting myself first, I corrected. If that looks like coldness to people used to me accommodating their needs, that says more about their expectations than my character. I heard rustling on her end of the call, like she was shifting position or moving to another room. I'm going to hang up now, she said. I can't do this anymore tonight. Okay, Kate. Yes? I really am sorry. Even if I'm also sorry it backfired. Both things are true. I know, I said. But sorry doesn't undo what happened. It just acknowledges it. She disconnected without saying goodbye. I sat in the parking lot for another 20 minutes, watching darkness settle over the park. Families packed up and headed home. Joggers completed final laps. The swings hung empty and still. My family wasn't going to recover from this. Not completely. Not in the way people imagine when they talk about healing and forgiveness and moving forward. Too much had been exposed, too many assumptions shattered, too many wounds opened that wouldn't close cleanly. But maybe that was okay. Maybe some relationships needed to end or transform so radically they became unrecognizable. Maybe the grief of losing the family I thought I had was necessary to make space for something more honest, even if that honesty meant more distance and less comfort. I started the car and drove home. The apartment felt emptier than usual, but empty wasn't the same as lonely. Empty was just space not filled with people who expected things I wasn't willing to give anymore. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 3 more calls. One from my mother asking me to reconsider helping Diane financially. One from my father suggesting we all attend family counseling. One from Diane herself, drunk and crying, saying she didn't know who she was without her career and her salary, and the identity she had built around being the successful daughter. I didn't answer any of them. I let the calls go to voicemail and listened to the messages later, hearing the desperation and confusion and anger in voices I had known my entire life. Then I deleted the messages and went back to building the future I had chosen. Work consumed more time as my start date for the oversight position approached. I completed the final training modules, received my security badge, attended introduction meetings with the team I would be joining. During one session, a colleague mentioned the Sterling defense case. "You're replacing the coordinator who recused himself from that review?" she said. "Family connection or something." "That was me," I replied. "I'm the one with the family connection." But the conflict review cleared me to work on the case. "Oh," she said, looking uncomfortable. "I didn't realize my sister was the compliance director at Sterling." I continued. "She's no longer with the company." The conflict board determined that didn't create ongoing issues with my assignment. The colleague nodded, still looking uncomfortable. "Got it. Well, welcome to the team." The directness made people uneasy, but I preferred it to whispered speculation. Better to control the narrative by stating facts clearly than letting rumors fill in gaps with assumptions. My first official task involved reviewing documentation from Sterling's credential verification processes. Thousands of pages outlining how the company certified military experience for consultants they hired. The files showed systematic problems: inflated ranks, extended deployment timelines, enhanced qualifications that didn't match service records. Some of it was probably innocent exaggeration, but much of it represented billing fraud, charging clients premium rates for consultants whose actual experience didn't justify those rates. As compliance director, Diane should have caught it, should have implemented controls to prevent it, should have audited the verification process regularly enough to identify patterns. She hadn't, and now I was documenting her failure as part of my official duties. I wrote my findings carefully, factually, without emotion or editorialization. The problems spoke for themselves through the evidence. I didn't need to add commentary about family betrayal or poetic justice. The documentation showed what had existed, what should have existed, and the gap between those states. Professional, clean, accurate. My team lead reviewed my draft report and nodded approvingly. "This is good work, Sullivan. Thorough without being excessive. Clear without being inflammatory." "Thank you. I know the family connection makes this complicated." "Not really," I said. "The documentation shows what happened. My relationship to the former compliance director doesn't change what the evidence says." "Still, it can't be easy." "It's not about easy or hard," I replied. "It's about doing the job correctly." She smiled slightly. "You're going to fit in well here." The report moved through review channels and eventually contributed to a larger assessment of Sterling's failures. The company survived, restructured, chastened, operating under enhanced oversight, but its reputation took years to recover. Diane's name appeared in the findings as the compliance officer who had failed to prevent or detect the irregularities, not accused of participating in fraud, but clearly identified as someone who hadn't done her job adequately. That assessment would follow her career forever, making it nearly impossible to work in defense compliance again. I read the final report in my office, alone, with the door closed. When I finished, I sat for a long time looking at nothing in particular. I hadn't caused Diane's professional destruction, but I had documented it with precision and thoroughness. I had done my job so well that there was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation, no way for her to claim the findings were biased or unfair. And I felt nothing about it except a quiet satisfaction that standards had been enforced regardless of personal connection. Wealth, I had learned, came in many forms. Financial security was one kind. The security of knowing I would enforce rules, even when it hurt people I loved, was another kind. Both required the same fundamental discipline: choosing principle over comfort, choosing accuracy over convenience, choosing to be right rather than popular. 3 months after the hearing, I received a letter. Handwritten. My sister's careful script on expensive stationery she probably couldn't afford anymore. I opened it standing at my kitchen counter. Kate, I'm writing because I can't call anymore. You won't answer, and I understand why. I sold the house. I'm renting a small apartment and driving a used sedan. I got a job in corporate compliance outside defense sector. Lower pay, less prestige, but stable. Mom and Dad ask about you constantly. I tell them I don't know because I don't. I spent a lot of time being angry at you for taking the oversight position, for presenting evidence at the hearing that made me look calculated, for writing the report that ended my career in defense work. But anger requires more energy than I have anymore. The truth is, you did your job. You followed rules. You documented accurately. If I had done the same, none of this would have happened. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect reconciliation. I just wanted you to know I finally understand the difference between being successful and being secure. You tried to tell me during that phone call, but I was too defensive to hear it. I'm building security now, slowly, without shortcuts. It's harder than I thought it would be. Maybe someday we can talk again. Maybe not. Either way, I hope you're doing well. Diane. I read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in my important documents folder. Not because I planned to respond, not because it changed anything fundamental, but because it represented something rare, genuine accountability without expectation of reward. That deserved acknowledgement, even if only privately. 6 months after the hearing, I stood in my new office at the Oversight Coordination Center and looked out over the military installation where I had spent so many years. The GS-13 position had begun officially. The salary increase deposited into accounts I was already maximizing. My retirement projections now showed I could retire comfortably in 18 months if I wanted, or work another 5 years and retire wealthy by any reasonable measure. I was 54 years old, financially independent, professionally respected, and almost entirely alone in terms of family connection. That aloneness should have felt like failure. Instead, it felt like the natural result of choosing clarity over comfort, boundaries over belonging, truth over tribal loyalty. My phone rang, an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Sergeant Sullivan, this is Lieutenant Jennifer Morrison. I'm calling about the mentorship program. I straightened slightly. Yes, I submitted an application to mentor junior NCOs. Right. We'd like to match you with a sergeant who's struggling with financial planning and transition preparation. She's 32, 6 years from retirement eligibility, and she mentioned specifically wanting guidance from someone who successfully navigated military finance. I smiled. I'd be happy to help. Great. Her name is Amanda Chen. She'll reach out to you directly to schedule an initial meeting. After the call ended, I sat at my desk and thought about what I might tell this junior sergeant about building security, about choosing discipline over display, about the freedom that comes from needing less while having more, about how the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's becoming so secure in your foundation that other people's actions can't shake you. I pulled out a notepad and started writing notes for our first meeting. Not a lecture, not a sermon. Just practical steps backed by personal experience. Start with 10%, I wrote. Before rent, before everything else. Pay yourself first. Track every dollar for 1 month. You'll be shocked by where money disappears. Debt is an emergency. Treat it like one. Comparison is poison. Build your security, not your image. The list grew to 2 pages before I stopped. Outside my window, young soldiers ran formations across the parade ground. They looked impossibly young, impossibly energetic, impossibly certain that effort alone would carry them through whatever came next. I had been that certain once, before David died, before I learned that security came from choices accumulated over decades, not from hoping circumstances would be kind. Now I got to pass that knowledge to someone else, someone who might listen because I had lived it rather than just studied it, someone who might build her own foundation strong enough to withstand betrayal, loss, or any other storm that tried to shake it. That felt like purpose. Not the purpose I had imagined when I first enlisted, serving country, protecting freedom, defending values, but purpose nonetheless. The kind built from wreckage and discipline in equal measure. the kind that lasted.